overall around the Donbas, where they're using a numbers advantage, lots of small dismounted attacks to wear down Ukrainian defenders who can't be pulled off the front line. But they will have a challenge if they want to sustain that level of loss, or rather if they claim to be able to sustain that level of loss, about further mobilization next year, which will be politically unpopular, but possibly bearable. Similarly, at some point later on in 2025, the Russians are going to need to stop producing new equipment, new main battle tanks, new armored personnel carriers, new artillery barrels, and that will require a different sort of output from their defense industry. Now, maybe they'll be able to compensate with what they're doing, bringing in from international backers, the North Koreans, maybe the Iranians, but their own defense industry is not inexhaustible.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, always a pleasure. I wonder if you can just begin by giving me your sense of where we are at the moment on the front line in this conflict.
Afternoon. I mean, as usual, I'll give the slightly boring caveat that there can be occasionally a lag, and there's a fair amount of misdirection sometimes in terms of what is going on. But at the moment, we seem to be seeing the continuation, maybe the end, depending on what happens with the weather, of very slow, kind of grinding Russian advances in parts of the east. They seem to have restarted some of their operations in the south. And then we have the ongoing situation in the north of the country, which is that the Ukrainians are trying to sort of force back the very small Kharkiv lodgement, whilst also maintain their position in Kursk. And recent weeks have seen a little bit more Russian activity there in terms of beginning to eat into some of the ground that the Ukrainians captured. And we're seeing a sort of steady flow of casualties and losses there, but it's not exactly an overwhelming Russian response. In the background to all of that, what is continuing is the Russian sort of strike campaign that is aimed at hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, their use of glide bombs along the front line. There's been heavy use of drones over the past month or so. And this is the context in which obviously the Ukrainians, and particularly Zelensky, are trying to bolster international support, look ahead to the US election, think ahead to 2025. So it feels like there haven't been radical changes, but some of those slightly more negative trends on the battlefield are still there, even though there are some things that the Ukrainians are doing. And this is by no means, a lost fight, but it still feels like the Russians are the ones who are making the headway.
And when analysing this conflict, how much attention should we pay to some of these relatively small incremental tactical advances on the front line by either side? I mean, in recent days, you've had Ukraine making advances in Seladov, for example. You've had Russia making tactical advances in the area on the border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts. I mean, some people have compared this conflict to the First World War in the sense that, both sides are quite well dug in. You've got the return of trench warfare. But I wonder to what extent it's better understood as a kind of who is winning the war when it comes to military aid and supply lines.
I think that's probably right in that what we see on the front line, and that's not the only place we should look at the deep strikes and what that says, is often a manifestation of the input factors. So personnel, mobilization, recruitment, training, the emphasis on certain kind of weapons and what that tells you about industrial output, refurbishment, international support, adaptation on the front line. So I think it's often slightly dangerous to draw large conclusions from very small movement on the ground because, well, a couple of things. One, it can be quite difficult to interpret what's actually happening. We see a lot of this from open sources. Institutions like RUSI also do first-hand research. You see a lot of people going out doing field research. There's also a time lag, and then understanding what it means. So we can see troops moving, but what does that tell us about the actual fight? The bigger picture is that question of what is it that we understand about the relative, if you like, strengths of the combatants as defined in terms of ingenuity, technology, people, and mass, or a way of duplicating mass.
And clearly, as we've discussed a lot on Frontline, there are issues around supply for Ukraine, particularly long-range weapons and whether they should be allowed to be used inside Russia to strike military targets. But from a Russian perspective, what supply issues do they have at the moment? I mean, we've spoken about the weapons they're receiving from Iran and North Korea. Reports even that North Korean troops have now been killed in Ukraine, which would suggest that, maybe that speaks to the manpower shortage of the Russians. What issues are they facing currently?
What they've got are a series of probably medium to longer term challenges. So the fact that the overwhelming majority of their equipment that they've been using on the ground so far has been refurbished means that they've been able to rapidly boost stocks of different kind of weapons, armored vehicles, all of those sort of things on the battlefield. And then some of what they did in terms of mobilizing people or using conscripts to give them a temporary personnel advantage in a number of places on the front line. And that has been particularly valuable in their move out of Donetsk and overall around the Donbas, where they're using a numbers advantage, lots of small dismounted attacks to wear down Ukrainian defenders who can't be pulled off the front line. But they will have a challenge if they want to sustain that level of loss, or rather if they claim to be able to sustain that level of loss, about further mobilization next year, which will be politically unpopular, but possibly bearable. Similarly, at some point later on in 2025, the Russians are going to need to stop producing new equipment, new main battle tanks, new armored personnel carriers, new artillery barrels, and that will require a different sort of output from their defense industry. Now, maybe they'll be able to compensate with what they're doing, bringing in from international backers, the North Koreans, maybe the Iranians, but their own defense industry is not inexhaustible. And again, Rusi's just released research with some of our open source partners, which have shown that there are still vulnerabilities, for example, in the Russian artillery system. They are still importing things like propellant or certain materials that are used in refurbishing gun barrels. I mean, these are one of the most finely machined parts of your kind of ground artillery, because the tolerances are very small to be an effective gun barrel. If it's too small, your gun barrel explodes when you try and launch shells out of it. And there are still areas where international sanctions enforcement could make a difference. There's also simply the cost of what it's going to take to sustain that for longer. And so if we get back to what the original Ukrainian plan was, which was slowly force the Russians back and get a strong sign of international support, what they wanted to do was show that they were in it for the long haul and convince the Russians that the cost was going to be significant over the medium term, which is why I think some of the mixed messaging that's going on at the moment is harmful to the Ukrainian cause.
That's really interesting. So do you think the big picture, which is hard to sometimes fully see, we get so bogged down in kind of incremental advances and the latest row over the latest piece of kit, but the big picture is, if this war drags on for a year or more, that is going to cause severe manpower and supply issues for the Russians?
It will. Now, the problem is that if we go back to those inputs at the moment, the Russians will calculate they've still got more of all of them. More people to call up, more material to draw upon, more, no, not guaranteed, weapons that they could bring in from elsewhere, and critically more political will. I mean, Putin is. There's experienced criminologists would probably quibble if I said this has become existential for Putin, but he's placed he's placed a significant proportion of his political credibility and the state's, if you like, Russian political credibility on this invasion, and he is betting big on something that the Russians can extract from it. And at the moment, that's preventing Ukraine from joining NATO or the EU and being essentially at the mercy of Russia, even if they failed to achieve lots of their military objectives. I think that for the Ukrainians, the challenge is that it doesn't feel like they have got yet guaranteed that international backing. There has been lots of good work and good words, particularly from Europe, on future support. So ramping up production of artillery shells from Europe, in theory towards 3 million a year, that would be a huge boost to Ukraine. But the problem is that hasn't been implemented yet, and I think there is some doubt over whether they're hitting the sort of the targets or the trajectory to get to that point. Similarly, Europe has talked a good game on broader support, but then we have sort of seen splits emerging within particularly those who are members of NATO about exactly how far to go. And fundamentally, the debate around escalation, the issue there was not really about the military utility of those weapons, I would argue. They were certainly useful, but they're not game-changing. But I think that sent a uncertain signal about the extent to which backers are really prepared to push against Russian rhetoric and Russian threats.
But I suppose the counter argument to that, and I know that's not your personal view, Matthew, you're just kind of advancing what people say, but the counter argument would be a lot of these fears of escalation have been unfounded so far. And that every time further military aid, be it anti-tank missiles, be it the F-16s, is provided to Ukraine, we don't see some over-the-top reaction from Putin.
Yes, so I mean, obviously, I was previously in government, so I should be wary of, if you like, appearing to sort of criticise my former colleagues unfairly. I think for a long time the approach that was taken through the international partnerships of incremental escalation was probably the right approach. It did to Russia what Russia spent years doing to others, which is just very slowly ratcheting up that support, but that no individual act really appeared to warrant a huge Russian reaction. And so we moved from providing weapons to providing armored vehicles to providing a lot more in terms of materiel support to eventually providing sophisticated systems like multiple launch rocket systems, tanks, all of those sorts of things, and then on to jets. And the UK led the way in a lot of that, cruise missiles and the like. The thing is, it doesn't seem to have maintained pace with the development of the campaign over, say, the past 12 months. I think the first signs, which were not caused by escalation fears, but really just bureaucracy, were that for the counteroffensive, it proved difficult to marry up training with equipment with building the force for the counteroffensive. One of the big lessons is that it just didn't all come together in time. And then they hit quite well prepared Russian defenses, and that was a disappointment. The thing is that over this year, what we've seen is that the Russians, they do escalate predominantly against the Ukrainians, and they've been running this sabotage campaign in Europe that Western intelligence chiefs are briefing about. And it largely seems to be the case that the conventional fight crossing backwards and forwards over the international border of Russia and Ukraine is actually factored into how the Russians are fighting that war. And so I think the Ukrainians would definitely argue there is no difference in providing us these weapons, given that we're running around with tanks. German armored vehicles are in Russia. American tanks are in Russia. British tanks are in Russia. The idea that providing a few more hardly game-changing missiles is now going to tip the Russians over is not credible. I think the one counter to that is something that the US in particular has talked about recently, which is that there were indications they felt back in 2022 when there was a risk of a collapse in the Russian position in the north, that some people in the Russian system talked about using nuclear weapons in the battlefield sense. And that has stayed in the background. But the truth is that, broadly speaking, this remains a conventional fight. And I think the Ukrainians have made a solid case that further Western support that is, largely speaking, conventional is within the bounds of how Russia is expecting this to go anyway. Given that Russia is importing drones from Iran and now building its own, it's firing North Korean artillery, it's using Chinese equipment, North Korean soldiers might now be turning up on the battlefield, and apparently it's importing Iranian ballistic missiles.
And very briefly, Matthew, just finally, to what extent are we now in a kind of holding pattern where we're waiting until the US presidential election 3 weeks tomorrow? If there was going to be further Western support for Ukraine anytime soon, it will probably come after the 5th of November and depending, obviously, on the result.
Yes, it certainly feels that way in terms of large, if you like, agenda-changing decisions. There is now a NATO mission to support Ukraine, which is standing up, and that is meant to provide a firmer foundation for some of the medium-term support. There are discussions clearly after Zelensky's recent round of visits about improving how both the UK and other partners can support them. But it does seem like that we're waiting to see what that future trajectory on the US side of things is. Now, that's largely because the US is the single largest provider of military support, and it provides some of the most sophisticated weaponry, and it's fundamentally is the guarantor of NATO deterrence, and so it sets the tone. Europe combined could and does provide about the same amount of support in terms of value, or at least it's pledged it. So Europe could probably do more in and of itself. And I think waiting to see for the US election result, whilst understandable, is injecting delay into the system where what should really be happening is the Ukrainians are planning for the next 6 to 12 months, setting out their requirements and thinking about the paths that they would take to achieve some success in that time regardless. Then what the election of the US president does is give them some kind of idea. Are they going to come under early pressure to negotiate or not? And if so, maybe Kursk comes into play there, but a lot depends on how many casualties they've taken. There is a danger that what we get is a bit of stasis and essentially a holding of the line where the Ukrainians, largely speaking, just take casualties. And then they have a similar challenge to 2022 and 2023, which is how do they mobilize enough people who can be taken away from the front line or recruited and train and equip them to really augment Ukraine's chances of springing a surprise on the Russians somewhere, maneuvering, beginning to address this issue of trajectory of the conflict. I think that's the big challenge, and there's a danger that we are sort of drifting towards actually closing off Ukrainian options over the next 12 to 18 months.
Matthew Savill, always appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
No problem.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.